The Cat Organ by H. Warner Munn. It was a fete day in Brussels, in the year of our Lord, 1549. All morning the fountains of the city had spouted free wine for the flushed and happy populace. Fragments of cake, no longer in demand, though they had no price, lay beneath the benches for the pigeons to peck at undisturbed. The people turned their backs upon the fountains and the booths, and now packed the edges of the principal streets. A singular procession was moving toward the palace. Philip II, the future King of Spain, sat beside his father, the Emperor, upon a palace balcony as the strange parade came by. At first, the royal guest, object of the holiday, found little to amuse him in the sight, although the citizens beneath rocked and howled in uproarious hilarity. At the head of the parade marched an enormous bull, its snowy coat brushed to a high gloss. Between his horns was balanced a tiny scarlet devil, from whose talons fireworks sprayed, replaced as often as they burned out by a monkey whose body had been completely shaven and gilded. Following 4 trumpeting youths who created bizarre sounds from strange and complicated instruments, came a small bear, seated precariously on a prancing horse, the ears and tail of which had been fancifully cut and hung with silver bells. Then a dancing girl, gaudy with gay ribbons, tinkling from head to toe with bright sequins. She twisted and turned to her clashing castanets, beckoning in mockery before an aged crone who stumbled on the rough cobbles as she followed, bent, withered and lame under the weight of faggots for the pyre upon which she was to be burned at evening. Introspective, her lips moved in prayer. Concerned only with her soul and its salvation, she ignored her tormentor. While above, Philip turned to his father with a sneer. "So should the wrath of God be visited upon every heretic, sire," he said, and the emperor nodded, but half aware of his son's remark. His attention had become fixed upon something beneath. Below there strutted the archangel Michael, in gold and purple robes, holding the scales of justice in his hands, which he shook from side to side as he pompously bowed to the throng, a very caricature of things holy. The emperor's face purpled. His pudgy fist came down upon the balustrade. "Now, by Our Lady," he swore, "they go too far. Do they think this is the feast of fools? Holy Church is attained by the boar. Guard!" Philip touched his father's arm. "Nay," he urged, "let them mock if they will. He can be marked. To seize him would halt the parade. Your men can reach him at any time. See yonder what new marvel comes." Approaching was the quaintest conceit of the mad company, a chariot drawn by mastiffs, a vehicle with a platform where a bear sat on a bench before an organ upon which he played. But such an organ! In place of pipes, 20 small boxes held each a cat. There were heavy-chested toms, high-sopranoed tabbies, small kittens and junior-sized mouses, alike only in one respect. The protruding tails were bound to the keys of the clavier by cords, so that it was necessary only to press one of these keys to produce a hellish squawk of pain. As it came beneath the balcony, another bear, astride a white horse, and carrying a scarlet pennon, rode up alongside. He dipped his pennon in salute. At once the organist sounded chords, running up and down the scale, until all 20 felines were furiously yelling in agony. But above their piercing shrieks, the howling of the excited mastiffs, and the applause of the crowd, there was plainly heard a hearty guffaw from above. Philip, the usual melancholy king, was laughing. The procession was a glorious success. The royal guest deigned to be pleased. The parade swung aside after leaving the vicinity of the palace. As it entered a poorer quarter of the city, the cat organ and the bear-ridden horse turned down a mean and reeking street. The other units went on. Picking their way among the litter and heaps of refuse, the small group veered off into a narrow alley. Here, in a rickety shed, the bearskins were removed, disclosing two men. The one who had bestrode the horse was a dwarf about 4 feet high, wrinkled, old, and ugly. His limbs were thin almost to emaciation, but he scurried about with a nervous vitality that belied his seeming age. "Guillaume," said the organist, clapping his hands together in glee, "your brilliant invention was the success you predicted. We made that glum hypocrite hold his sides." The dwarf creaked out a rusty giggle as he unloosened the cats from their boxes, with little care or sympathy for their piteous moans, as he placed them in a cage that stood in the corner of the shed. "Aye, it was good music to hear, but I liked it better than the king. Was it not my friend's music? Give me no praise, I want no credit. The success and the honor is yours, Bourdois Ganard. I merely supplied the idea. You made the machine, found the instruments, and furnished the sweet gallimaufry of yowls. I loved every note of that music, because it was you that was making it, and I knew while listening that the organ would bring you to a notable eminence among men." There was the faintest suspicion of a sneer in the last words. Ganard did not perceive the subtle meaning behind them. He smiled. "Well said. It should bring me notice and perhaps fortune. Certainly enough to get us and the boy out of this stinking den." He turned. The boy in question darted into the shed, a bright-eyed, vivacious little lad of about 12. He greeted his father with a hug, but cast no welcoming glance upon the dwarf. His face changed as an expression of anger mingled with pity came upon it. He had seen the cage of cats, some still mewing and twisting in pain, others with their yellow and green eyes large, fixed balefully upon Ganard. They glared as they paced up and down the cage, picking their way among the kittens, which lay licking strained ligaments and hairless spots, torn and bleeding from cord and clamps. "Father!" cried the boy, his voice breaking from its high, clear note. "You must not hurt my cats. I am ashamed to look at them. How will they be my friends any more if you do this to them?" "Why should you wish to be friends with cats, Théophile?" "I would be friends with all things. Look at poor Galtier. See how he suffers. The cords cut his tail. And Tybalt there. My little Tibby who was so gentle and liked to be petted. How he hates you now." He pointed at a gaunt, brindle animal that switched its tail viciously against its sides as it eyed the elder Ganard, ever and again tearing slivers out of the wooden bars with its long claws. "Aye, the beast would like to get at me," mused the man pleasantly. "I will take that out of him the next time we have a concert." The dwarf chuckled from his corner, a harsh, dry interruption. Ganard looked at him, scowling. "Come, lad, let's go to the table. I hunger enormously. When I tell Tib how sorry I am." And the boy pressed against the bars, his bare arms thrust among the pain-maddened cats. "God!" Ganard choked. He stopped, aghast. The creatures, instead of striking out at the exposed arms, were seeking the pats and caresses he was giving them. They purred answers of contentment to his crooning sympathy. His father reached out to snatch Théophile away. The scene changed at once. The 20 cats as one surged against the bars, spitting, snarling, clawing to get out upon their tormentor. Ganard drew back. Like you, don't they?" The dwarf came forward to see. He grinned. "What if they should get out some night when you are sleeping here in the shed?" Gunnar forced a laugh. "Small danger of that. I look at the bars every night and test the latch myself. I've no fancy to be cat meat. Their memories are short. Come, lad, hungry?" The three left the shed. With their departure the snarling died down, until only the munching and stamping of the white horse was heard as evening came and the shed grew dark. That night Gunnar told the lad why he hated cats. They sat long at the table, the dwarf silent, darting a red-eyed glance at one or the other as the tale progressed. Theophide learned for the first time of his grandmother, Ivga Benrick, daughter of a werewolf, and the frightful bargain she had made with the Master, an elemental being who hated the entire race of mankind as a generic species. This almost immortal creature's dearest wish was the extermination of the family of Gunnar to its most distant ramifications, in vengeance for a trick which Ivga's father had played upon him. Theophide learned for the first time that Ivga had preserved her own life only because of this bargain, fleeing from Hungary in the company of a young troubadour and protected on the long journey to France by the Master for his own foul reasons. His motive became evident quite soon. During Ivga's and Hugo's life together in Blois, the city became known as the City of Werewolves, owing to the vast quantity of such monsters that were reputed to make their home there and in the surrounding country. Theophide could easily imagine his grandmother's deep remorse when she learned how, in her trance, in return for her life, which she valued less and less, that her compact meant that one of her descendants in each generation should become the slave of the Master, until one of that line should meet and definitely defeat him. On her dying bed, she revealed the dreadful secret to her 7 sons, bidding them to scatter to the 4 corners of the earth. Fear came over each of them. Each thought that he might be the one. With tears they forgave her and prepared to do her bidding. And then Theophide learned why his father hated cats. "It is a matter of common knowledge, my son, that if a cat leaps over the dead body of a human, that corpse, when lain in the grave, will rise and walk. It stalks stealthily through the night, in the waste and lonely places, seeking the blood of men, so that its own filthy existence may be prolonged. These are the living dead, the horrors of the dark, a curse to humanity. I say, cursed be they, and cursed be the agent that makes them what they are. God and his saints protect us against them, lest we become such, for the traveller at night rides in dread of his life, thinking of his doom should one of these taste his blood. Upon his death, he knows he too would become a vampire. And should he hear, as he passes through the forest tracks, or along some mountain cleft from which he cannot turn, a low cry, like a sick child or a woman in distress, he loosens his knife and crosses his breast with shaking fingers. Somewhere nearby there sits the cunning, coaxing vampire, luring the unwary to the spot where it waits, its lips red from its latest victim. Your grandmother passed from among us. Her body was not cold before madness entered into our peaceful souls. Invisible to us then, the demon had come. We quarrelled, a thing which we brothers had never done, quarrelled in anger and greed, an ignoble dispute over the division of our inheritance. Careless words, led to hard words. Suddenly your uncle Anatole, the eldest by a moment, struck Hugo his twin. Hugo drew a dagger, steel flashed, and Anatole died there in the hall, a great wonder and surprise in his dulling eyes. While he still breathed, Hugo repented his sin, for the two had lived as one. Crying, "Wait, brother, I come with you!" Before we could snatch the blade from him, it was in his breast, he falling across Anatole, holding him close as his lips touched his sibling's cheek. Only a few seconds had passed before we 7 had become 5. Then, in a dark corner, we saw a swirling grey mist like river fog. It reeked, it coiled, and from it came a voice, a strange, dry, unhuman voice, oh horrid to hear. It chuckled and gloated and was pleased. Gunnar shivered at the remembrance. He closed his eyes against the recall. It said, "Children of Ivgar, the master keeps his word. Brother slays brother, and the compact binds you all." And straight from the mist, a moon-eyed cat, swart and sooty, came leaping toward us on bandy legs. It bounded across Anatole, it circled and swung, and leapt over Hugo. It fled back into the mist, and it and the mist were gone together. So we knew their intended fate, and why the cat had come. It was not the cat's leaping that had cursed the hapless dead. No, not that mere fact, dreadful as it seemed. The cat, which is familiar, mysterious, and too knowing night animal, which shares the secrets of midnight with the bat and the ghouls that ride the cold wind, had been but the messenger of the evil one, to bid the corpses rise and come to do his bidding. None of us wanted to share in such an inheritance. Nothing could have tempted us to remain in that castle of accursed memories. We feared the master would again appear and take toll of us. If we separated, we hoped that we would throw him off the track. Perhaps some of us might live in peace. One went to Russia, I will not say his name, lest furry ears might be listening. Gunnar jested slyly at the cage. Another to the south, to trade among the Isles of Spice. A third dwells somewhere in Germany. My elder brother went to Scotland, and I came here. We married. Surely none of us were inclined to lead a monkish life, being no more than human after all. I suppose that the rest, like myself, knew that our children might be in danger, nay, would be, but hoped, each of us, that ours might be safe. Before we went, we took little things we desired, as a remembrance of our lost home. My brother in Scotland has our father's rapier. It is said to be the first true rapier ever invented. Grandfather called it Widowmaker. He saved grandmother's life with it in Pontcourt. He protected her with it against all who came against him, from Hungary to France. Brother took also as his right, being eldest, half of a key which, when united, unlocks a tomb in the grounds of our castle in Blois. In this tomb we placed a book that tells how the curse began and how the master was first defeated. A holy bishop, one of our family, lies buried there. We believed that the master dare not harm the book, and we hope that by it someone may yet find knowledge that will aid us, or our kin, to fight the monster. As protection against carelessness, if one in reckless pride and vanity should think himself stronger than in truth he may be, we split the key. Thus, It will take at least 2 to enter, lest we loose the book and its promise. As second eldest, I carry the other half on this silver chain. I have been thinking lately that something might happen to me. If so, you should have the key. Take it now, wear it always. That sad night we burned the castle and fled. It was the burial pyre of your uncles Hugo and Anatole. Their ashes blew away in the wind, along with your grandmother Ivga. She never knew sorrow in that country, other than the little sorrows that come to all people. Even the master cannot create slaves from ashes, so we cheated him in this generation, and he cannot touch one of our children, lest he takes one of us first, for so the contract reads. Of course, if he can find us, he may still take one from among us 5. I sometimes feel that I might be in the most danger, because remembering that cat in the mist, I hate and dread all cats and treat them as I do. They are allies of the master, and I know well he is patient and tireless in pursuit of his revenge. The dwarf had listened without comment. Now the 3 sought their beds of hay in the shed which was their common abode. The boy and the dwarf slept in the loft, but the elder Gunnar, from bravado, always slept below, near the cats, whose least motion in the dark caused him to stir uneasily. The night passed without event. With the first rays of morning the boy awakened to find the servant shaking his shoulder and muttering, "Up, up with the sun, lad. No food for sleepy folk." Yawning, Theophide dropped through the hole in the floor to the hay below. The elder Gunnar still slept. Without waking him, the boy stretched luxuriously, eyeing his former friend, Tybalt, in a mood of suspicious awe. Not offering his accustomed pat, he mounted the white horse and rode him bareback to the misty riverbank for the morning drink and bath. Though he could not swim, Theophide wallowed about in the shallows. A sharp pain in his foot made him leap, but the pain was forgotten when he groped about in the mud and touched the handle of a small hatchet, lost from a wall above where some workmen had been putting up a scaffolding. It had not yet gathered any rust. He was delighted. With this treasure tucked in his waistband, after donning his clothes, he rode homeward, eager to show what he had found. As he came near the shed, he heard the angry squall of a cat. His father's voice rose in a high yell of terror, which choked midway in a gurgle. He dug his heels into the ribs of the horse and thundered into the shed. The first thing that he noticed was that the cage was empty. The second, that a mass of vari-colored fur swayed and shook nearby. Then the air seemed to be full of cats, as Gunnar plunged forward upon his face, streaming red through his rags, and the cats that had exploded away sprang in for the kill. The boy felt a wet hand on his leg, a hand that felt like claws. Guillaume, the dwarf, had laid hold upon him. The fingers of both hands seemed sharper than common, and were bloody as well. And as a beginning of the truth made itself manifest to the horrified boy, Guillaume burst into his customary harsh titter. "Faith, then," he cackled, "here's a jape and a joke for many a day. The first organist to be killed by his organ. Laugh, boy, laugh." The horse flared his nostrils at the dwarf. He snorted in terror and backed away. A hateful change was beginning to make itself apparent, both to Theophide and the frightened animal that he rode. Surely the wrists of the dwarf were thinner now, the hands smaller and more hairy, The nails were truly claws. The ears had become pointed, the head looked that of a wolf, and the whole body was quivering in the throes of metamorphosis. A muzzle was taking shape. Suddenly the boy had complete understanding. The master, Loup-garou. He snatched the hatchet loose. "Taste iron, murderer!" and struck at the ugly head. Yammering, the dwarf went down, twitching and foaming at his shapeless mouth. The horse reared, wild-eyed and panic-stricken. Theophide buried his hands in the streaming mane, and they stampeded through the door of the shed over the master's body as he fell. One glance backward filled his mind with a dreadful sight, damnable in its significance, always to remain with him throughout his life. At the other end of the shed, in solemn parade, were marching the 20 cats. As a single line, the tortured animals were already bounding, one by one, across the mangled corpse of his father. Sick at heart, longing for a clean death, Theophide rode for the river Seine. On the bank the horse roamed free, and, straight and determined, the boy walked, waist deep into the water. As he crossed his breast and bowed his head and commended his soul to God, asking forgiveness for his contemplated sin, he felt the key beneath his shirt. The thought came to him, like a whisper from a saint, that somewhere was the book of hideous repute. It told of the master. He had been defeated once. Perhaps, if he could find the book, he too could confront the monster to its doom. How to get it? The book was in France, sealed away in the bishop's tomb. The other half of the key was in Scotland. Then a thought. A grim, cold smile aged his young face. He would live. He would work. He would save and scrape. He would starve if need be. But he would go to Scotland, find his uncle Theobald, and get the key. He left the water, captured the feeding horse, and set out away from the city, riding blindly anywhere. Direction did not matter now. Vengeance was his only thought, as his lips moved in prayer for the lost soul of his father. Vengeance, he was certain, would be his. How, Huguenots? By H. Warner Munn. The roofs of the old wooden houses were a wilderness of gutters and crooked gables, of warped and leaning chimneys, of rotting beams and decaying towers. Flat in a lead-lined gutter, hidden by a bush that had taken root in the debris, a ragged man lay, peering down 3 stories into a Parisian street called Love Lane. All around there sounded the rattle of drums and the dry hacking cough of intermittent shots, while above, the sky was red with morning and mounting flames. The air was full of the clash and din of the tocsin and the flood of sounds which poured from rocking bells in every tower and steeple. It was August in the year of our blessed Lord, 1572. The day was that of the holy and sainted Bartholomew. Paris was celebrating, but there was no spirit of praise or sympathy or worship in Love Lane. Instead, it echoed with shrieks and curses and prayers cut short. A band of furious men, composed partly of the night watch and partly of the rabble of the city, had entered its upper end some minutes before. Theophide Gunnar, now a man of 35, forewarned and realizing the futility of resistance, had fled with his arquebus to the rooftops, and one spot being safe as another, had decided to wait there for nightfall. There were times, as he waited, when he condemned himself for deserting the faith of his fathers for that of the Huguenots. But as often as he thought of this, his memory turned to the blue eyes and golden hair of the girl wife whom he had left across the river when he went to seek and obtain aid from a relative in Love Lane. There was a boy, too, back in Blois, where he had met the girl while working for her father, a son whose name was Leon, but whose good looks were all his sweet mother's. As he thought of these things, he smiled. The loss of heaven itself seemed slight, considering what he had gained. A lark sang, not 10 feet away, charmed with the freshness of the summer morning. The limpid air played softly among the leaves of the hardy bush, and below, children and women were dying horribly, their menfolk, snarling defiance, dying with a little content if they first had time to snatch a weapon and get their backs to a wall. Gunnar sighed and lay close in his gutter. After a long time the crowd dispersed and went raging away to other scenes. There was a pitiful silence along the narrow street, where the dead lay thick and piled high around the doorways where they had been thrown from within, or where some householder, bereft of all save life, had made a furious stand, till even that was snatched away. From afar, cries of "À bas, Coligny! À bas, les Huguenots!" rose to the lofty rooftop, and again, from a filthy alley in the rear of his refuge, he heard an indescribably savage chanting, a derisive version of a popular Protestant song. How, Huguenot! Faites pals au papago! A woman screamed. There was laughter. After a long time, a shot. He knew that the carousing mob had found another excuse for abominable revelry. He did not climb the roof tree to look down. There was nothing he could have done, and it was over. He wondered if God, who watches each sparrow fall, had listened. Like rats, the Huguenots of Paris were being hunted down, and it was hot in the deep gutter, but the ragged refugee did not move. August heat struck into Love Lane, peopled, he was sure, only by the dead. The stench of a butcher's shambles drifted up. Still he waited patiently, though his nostrils wrinkled in distaste. He seldom now looked down. The afternoon waned, and found him chewing the bitter green leaves to assuage a burning thirst. The sun, now hidden behind a cloud of smoke, showed him little mercy. It hung low over towers and roofs, red and brazen as though it shone through a canopy of hell. Beneath the slow coils of that pall, the rattle of firing went on, now far, now near, while occasionally other frantic cries punctuated the dull uproar. All day the drums grumbled sullen gutturals of menace. At nightfall, a rolling volley of firearms and a clatter of hoofs betrayed the entering of a troop of horses into the desolated street. Their leader was a young man, perhaps 20 or 21, sitting his horse superbly. He wore a grey riding coat and was a head taller than any of his companions. Jewels gleamed in his bonnet, and there was pride in his face. The riders that followed him were richly and handsomely dressed, though some wore burnished corselets and cuirasses over satin coats, and lace collars floated above jerkins of leather or plain buff. A herd of raving men straggled behind in disorder, their faces alight with furious glee. A head borne aloft upon a pike was, in a manner, prophetic of Parisian amusements some 200 years in the future. The wolf pack of Henry le Balafré, Duke of Guise, was hunting in the twilight for stray game. Gunnar noticed that all wore bands of white around their left arms and white crosses in their caps and bonnets. With some elation, he had begun to tear a strip from his own shirt when his attention was sharply distracted by a movement in the huddle of bodies directly beneath him. A white arm had feebly lifted and as quickly dropped again. Gunnar would have thought nothing of the matter, except to breathe a prayer of pity, had not a flash of green stones glittered on the pale wrist. With eyes sharpened by anxiety, he pierced the shadows, saw a mass of golden hair and a lovely, wan face that he knew well, although a trickle of blood had clotted upon the side of the dear head. "Croisette!" he gasped, and recognized his wife, whom he thought to be safe in the Faubourg Saint-Germain, where no massacre had taken place. The recognition had taken a brief part of a second. Instantly he stared about to see if any had noticed the movement. None too soon. He saw the finger of Henry of Guise was pointing at the heap of bodies near the wall, and that he was turning as if to shout. Apparently, no other had seen the sign of life. His decision was instant. From the rooftop, the bellow of an arquebus awoke the echoes in the miserable street. Guise reeled in his saddle. His bonnet was snatched from his head, shedding a sprinkle of jewels as it flew. A howl went up from below, and a scattering, aimless volley chattered among the chimney pots. A tile fell and broke into bouncing fragments. Gunnar recoiled deeper into his shelter, cursing his unsteady hand. He reloaded with frantic haste. A shadow fell across him as he worked. He looked up and over his shoulder with a fearful squint, when a voice spoke, whose malignant accents he remembered well. "Your work is wasted, Theophide. You have come to the end of your days." The dwarf, whom he had known as Guillaume, his father's servant and companion, sat cross-legged upon the mossy roof, leering obscenely at him. Below, the men were beating in the house door. He continued silently with his loading. He tamped down the powder. The calm voice went on. "Do you think, Gunnar, that you could outrace the long reach of the master? I would have had you in Brussels, as I meant, if you had not struck me down as I was changing. That brought me agony you cannot imagine. Death, after that, was too good for you. You must suffer, and know that suffering was because of me. Would it interest you to know that I caused your wife to come here, looking for you, just as the killing began?" The roar in the street below was louder now. The stunned Guise sat unsteadily in the saddle, looking up. 10 years ago, I began to spread the seed of calamity in Paris. It grew, blossomed, and has fruited today. When will you mortals learn that the master knows what you plan, far in advance of your childish plotting? Gunnar could hear the tramp of feet inside the house. He knew that the hunters were climbing the crazy, crooked stairways. Methodically, he finished tamping the powder. He dropped in the slugs, not replying to the taunting words. "I knew," went on the master, "when you and your woman came to Paris to seek aid from her uncle, so that you might cross to Scotland and secure the remainder of the key to the bishop's tomb. I am aware that your 5-year-old son in Blois has the other half of the key in trust for him. I will take excellent care of him, I assure you. Excellent care. It is quite possible that whoever enters that tomb may be surprised at what he finds there. I feel certain that he will." A ghoul, unearthing a freshly buried corpse, could have chuckled his pleasure no less happily. Theophide Gunnar did not speak, but swung the bell muzzle of the arquebus around till it pointed at the master's black, naked chest. He pulled the trigger. A haze of smoke hit the gloating face. It passed, and the cackle of the master's mirth rang out as the rabble came out upon the rooftop. "Load again, gunner, if you have time. Load again. Here are the bullets you loaned me. Load and try again." He cast the slugs in Gunnar's face. He turned and vanished in the blue swirl of powder smoke. As the enemy came near, Gunnar's brave heart failed. With the clarity of thought given to the dying, he perceived that he had lost his battle against the evil genius of his family, of his race. He knew also that his very cause was lost. All over Paris, men were dying because he had come there. He saw clearly that the very existence of a Gunnar anywhere meant sorrow and calamity for that place. The foremost of the butchers that had drenched Paris in blood on that fateful day reached out a hairy hand to grasp him. He could expect torture. Théophile Gunnar, poised upon the gutter edge, tall, straight, handsome, he leapt and hung in the air as a diver does, and plunged headlong into the street. He had chosen his spot well. When they came to him, they saw that peace was on his face. A trail of blood showed where he had dragged his broken body to a pile of corpses near a wall. A white arm was around his neck, and golden hair mingled with his own brown locks. A man stooped to wrench away a green gemmed bracelet from the limp wrist. Seeing that both still feebly breathed, he drove a pike through the entwined bodies and left them pinned together there. After the guisards had gone, the dwarf stood silently by the pair. He bent down at a flicker of the man's eyelids. The brown eyes opened, but saw nothing. They filmed, and the head rolled slowly sideways until the cheek rested upon golden hair. "Croisette!" Lips fluttered and touched, and the eyes closed. The master followed the rioting rabble, where a roar of voices sounded. He was well content with himself and his battle with his enemy. The toll of massacre and intolerance that he had incited and encouraged would now go on unhindered until 30,000 lay dead in Paris. A score was being piled up that would not be wiped out by all the dead in the great street fight at Cahors. Chatillon, too, would ride through the faubourgs of Paris 9 years later, remembering his father Coligny and giving no quarter. Still, the tally of this August day would remain unpaid. Men would fall by hundreds, speared at Courtas and Ivry, and yet not one of the tragic dead of St. Bartholomew's Day would be avenged. The issue was men, as a race, against the master, not Catholic against Huguenot. And the kindly concealing dark came down upon the deserted and quiet street, which was called Love Lane. The Wreck of the Santa Isabel by H. Warner Munn. The weather, though it is June, is as wild as December. No one remembers such a season. It is the more strange since we are on the business of the Lord, and some reason there must be for what has befallen us. Letter of Duke of Medina, Sidonia, to Philip II, King of Spain, from Corunna. God caused the winds to blow, and they were scattered. Inscription on English medals, struck to commemorate the Armada's defeat. All day the shot-torn Santa Isabel had wallowed down the channel, her deck, ill-manned, a welter of corpses. Now, as night drew on, the galleon, with her sister ships of the once great Armada, prepared to stand and fight. The engagement was brief and deadly. Again, the small nimble craft of the harrying English outmaneuvered the unwieldy Spanish vessels. Sailing close to the wind, a raking discharge of chain shot and a hail of balls from sakers, falcons, and bastard culverins spread destruction along the 3 decks of the ship. It seemed the fabric of the vessel itself was bleeding. It was the year of our Lord, 1588, the day, August 9th, and the scene, the Battle of Gravelines. "Into her, bully boys! Get the magazine!" The small cannon spoke once more, a ragged broadside to sting the giant as the tiny squadron swung away to reload, turn, and come racing back, like sparrows protecting their nest from Corby crows. The running fight went on. Medina Sidonia had hoped till the last to connect with the Duke of Parma and to be reinforced. Instead, fire ships had mowed down the soldiers on his unwieldy troop ships until, from once being overmanned, the galleons were now in danger of running ashore for lack of able hands. Although some of the balls rebounded from the high, bulging sides, it was death to tend the rigging. The life expectancy of a helmsman was calculated coldly at approximately 7 minutes. The marksmanship of the sharpshooters who swung in great arcs at English main and mizzen was deadly accurate, even though mortality among themselves was equally great. Far, now, from Parma, the Battle of Gravelines continued in progress. It was a long time yet to the shelter of darkness. The eagle formation, which had been of such value against the Turks in the Battle of Lepanto, was still maintained. Heavy galleons for the body, lighter ones, including galleasses, for the wings, and troop ships making up the tail of the fighting bird. Unfortunately, Don John of Austria did not command this fleet against Hawkins. Achilles, the Spanish called him, with revilings, and Drake, El Drac, the Dragon of England. Even so, this clumsy formation had beaten along intact, powerful in its mass, almost impregnable, except for the loss of, here and there, a straggler forced to lag too far behind. Now the 2 powers were locked in the death struggle, the final battle of the 10 days' flight. Since the disruption by the fire ships, the greater part of the fleet was far to leeward, driving toward the banks of Dunkirk. Still fighting in this group were 40 ships, none of which had struck their colours. Though most of the English had lain yard arm to yard arm as the whole reeled on, the Spaniards endured 5 hours of being torn to pieces by cannon shot. At 3 hours before sunset, the firing had blended into a continuous roar of sound. The English fire, at close range, now went through the weakened and battered sides of the Santa Isabel. Rocks would have shattered at the impact of these forceful cannonets and culverins. Against them, deafened gunners served the small demi-cannons, culverins, and falconets. These were all that remained of the Santa Isabel's mighty weight of metal, an armament dismounted, warped, or split by the impact of English shot. From the maintop nothing could be made out through the smoke at sea level, but below, in the Pole, pinnace and barquet drew near the galleon, discharging their broadsides and gave place to the next. Here and there, a Spanish flyboat, a gunboat manned with oars, slid through the fighting with a ragged limping stroke, met a pinnace, and sank it, but such supporting slashes were now very few. The Santa Isabel struggled on towards its doom. There was no flinching on the decks, while the air shook with the roar of the artillery. Priests went up and down under the hottest fire, crucifix in hand, confessing and absolving the dying. Then the patter of drum beats and a cry of "St. George and Gloriana!" A privateer drew close through the smoke. It flared red as a volley tore through to enter low in the galleon's hull. "England!" A hoarse cheer went up from dry throats, when a coughing roar and a burst of white flame showed that the Spanish magazine had exploded. Had it not been for the fact that the powder was nearly gone, that would have been the end of the Santa Isabel at once. But although crippled, she did not sink, drifting on with fire showing through her ports and swathed in black, reeking clouds of murk. A brusque flamity of drums. "Boarding party! Away!" The doughty little bark prepared to close with the Leviathan, pikes gleaming, grappling irons already a-swing to clinch the gilded remnants of the Santa Isabel's taffrail. Before this could take place, there came an interruption. From behind the flaming galleon, a galeasse, like a many-legged water-bug, came striding out in all its pomp of striding oars to engage the bark. The single gunboat it carried spoke its curse, like a dragon's roar. Calavers answered, and brought the gunner down before there was time to reload. With brave banners flying free and gay they met, but when a well-directed chain shot sent the Spanish standard into the water, along with the stubby mast which had supported it, the small sail billowed down to cover the rowing pit. Instantly, for the privateer, this was set aflame with a pot of wildfire. A storm of carronade balls crashed into the helpless galeasse between wind and water. The flimsy side opened like a door with a burst of bubbles and frenzied screams. The Spaniard heeled over to meet the wave which sank it, taking with her soldiers, sailors, and 200 chained and desperately struggling galley slaves. This short and decisive battle had distracted the attention of the English from their chosen prey. The mistake was brought home to them quickly, for their own sail now flapped uselessly beneath the mountainous side of the galleon. Boarding was impossible. Red-hot cannonballs fell from the heights into the hold of the bark, and the Santa Isabel limped along after her consorts, leaving the bark behind her, burning herself in isolated spots, but victor for the moment. The bark, a pillar of fire, presently subsided into the cloud-darkened sea, leaving few survivors to cling to the floating wreck which littered the wake of the fleeing armada. By sunset the wind rose again, the firing ceased, and the smoking canopy drifted away. Far behind the mass of the Spanish fleet, the Santa Isabel's condition was becoming desperate also. Panic seized upon the soldiers who, despite terrible losses, still outnumbered the seamen. They snatched control, chose their own course, veering away from the dogged pursuers which clung grimly to the main body as darkness fell, hoping to elude them thus. The natural result was that, after a miserable night spent in attending to the wounded, throwing overboard the dead, and making such repairs possible to the vessel, they lagged behind so far that the squadron was barely in sight. There was no fresh water. The only powder remaining was in the guns on deck, loaded from what had been brought up before the magazine exploded, and a few arquebuses held ready for the next attack which would surely come. 104 men walked the deck, haggard and without hope. They were entering the North Sea, still able to steer, but at present in water that was shoaling every moment, so that they could see the yellow foam where waves broke on the banks. The English hung, menacing and grim, a mile on the weather quarter, the larger units drawing as much water as the galleon, and most of the smaller having turned towards harbours for further supplies. The pursuers did not advance. About noon, after prayers, the wind shifted to the southwest. With the remaining rags of sail full bent, the Santa Isabel wore away from the dangerous shallows. Now the English held, as she plunged forward into the North Sea, but seemed satisfied to let the elements finish the work they had begun. 2 days later, the crippled Spaniard passed the mouth of the Forth, and the sea wolves turned back. Still attempting to join the tatters of the Armada, the Santa Isabel sailed on, her complement reduced by half, a ghastly proof that they were not the only ones with pain and famine was given them in the morning. The mutilated ship wallowed on all forenoon, through the floating carcasses of many hundreds of mules and horses. They had been flung overboard into the night to save water for the men. The galleon reeled on in forlorn pursuit on a rising gale as far as the Orkneys, passing those surf-lashed coasts in weather that steadily grew more wild. Here, the Santa Isabel fell in with 2 other galleons, in as ill case as herself, learning from them that the fleet had separated with little hope that any might be able to turn back to Spain. The 3 continued along the wild coasts of the Hebrides until, struck by violent squalls that beat from every point of the compass, they were driven apart. With 14 still living, Santa Isabel, barely maintaining steering way, blundered on toward her inevitable destiny. Her companions found their peace a little earlier, splintering themselves on the iron cliffs of Connaught. Those of their crews that escaped the axes and skeins of those who attempted by plunder were shot or hanged on the spot by the English troops garrisoned there, who also met the invaders on the narrow, surf-lashed beaches. It was night again around the Santa Isabel. Away to port, somewhere in the darkness, a flare of light, ruddy as hellfire, lit up the tumbling clouds. Seconds after, thunder came sullenly over the dark water. Another commander, rather than be taken or wrecked upon an inhospitable coast, had thrown a torch into his powder magazine and gone with all his dreams of conquest. Leon Gunnar leaned on a still-standing section of the 4-foot-thick bulwark, famine weakened and thirsty, wondering if those unknown dead were happier in the sea or were more at rest than they had been before the crash of exploding powder had left them of their earthly problems. The doubt, hanging in his mind, had kept him for days from ending his misery in the sea. This long, through days and nights of dread, the galleon had been a charnel below decks, fever delirium speaking in hellish screams and dying oaths from the dying. Now there was quiet. There were none living in unendurable pain. Leon was grateful that the ship was free from that horror at last. There were none living. Officers had been picked off early in the fighting. Many of the crew had died from sheer exhaustion, either in battle or from overwork in the hopeless struggle for home. 4 days the first mate had served as captain. 4 days and nights he had not slept. On the morning of the 5th day, Leon recalled, the weary man looked red-eyed into the rising sun, smiled mysteriously at someone he thought he saw there, and mounting the bulwark, stepped open-armed toward the sunrise, and the waiting friend, whose name was Death. Low in the water, a seam having opened hours before, the survivors drifted toward the Irish coast. Leon debated incuriously the probable mode of his death. Would they sink before they were smashed against the rocks of Sligo Bay? He hardly cared. The end was the same in either event. Far behind, in the waste of turbulent waters, shone a following light. It twinkled, it waved, unsteady, as though it winked and signalled at the iron-bound lantern upon the Santa Isabel's carved high poop. Leon ran back, lifted the lantern and waved it from side to side. The thought of a rescuing Spanish vessel was dispelled when, faint and dulled by distance, came the threatening growl of an English cheer above the slap and spatter of the driving spume along the high, unwieldy stern. Leon let the lantern drop into the sea. He ran forward to where the weary men slaved at the pumps. A little more sail could yet be raised. Beaten by the howling wind and torrential rain, they slid a trifle faster toward the deadly coast, a most problematic haven, but more promising than the enemy. When morning came, it found the Santa Isabel all but a derelict hulk, with another mast carried away and only a rag of canvas giving steerage way. Terribly near and menacing, a pursuing pinnace spun, a cockleshell of a boat, but filled with dauntless, angry men. Its captain, too late to join the Gravelines harrying, had sworn to turn back only as a master of a galleon. At last he had spied his long-sought quarry, now only a quarter league away. Steadily, remorselessly, the little Vindictive bore down upon the wounded Titan. In an hour after sunrise, she was under fire. Her third shot, unanswered for the Santa Isabel, smashed through the galleon's rudder pintle and crippled her like a hamstrung elephant. The Spanish vessel swung about, to lie in the trough of the waves, careening wildly, foam spurting over the stumps of the masts. The English howled and drew close. In the melee, a round shot hulled the Santa Isabel, adding a new menace. Through this rent, water poured into the hold from a myriad of widening seams, now opened, now closed by the strain of the racking seas. The Vindictive drew alongside, and a sailor roped high on the single mast, with a dozen or more muskets beside him in the cask, which did duty as a fighting top, picked off one by one the sweating, heart-sick Spaniards as they manned the pumps. From different quarters of the deck, a spatter of shots answered from pistolets and heavy matchlock muskets, the secret weapon of Spain which had done such deadly work in the Netherlands against armour. Alas for the Santa Isabel! The replying fire against the pinnace's swivel guns soon ceased. Powder at last was exhausted. Suspecting a ruse, the Vindictive sheered off, sending a chain shot screaming through a yard. It fell. Under it lay 2 crushed seamen and Leon Gunnar, unharmed but enwrapped in a wet fold of canvas. He felt himself tangled in a crushed web of cordage that bit and stung like steel whips. A bite of strangling cord tightened about his throat. Then the painful pressure, the shots, cries, shrieking wind and booming seas melted together into a solemn diapason, fading into silence and darkness shot with fire. Again the English drove close, while the sailor at the masthead, in a wreath of smoke, swung a hissing missile about his head and hurled it upon the galleon's deck. The earthen pot of wildfire broke and let loose its devouring contents. It flamed into a cold blue and poisonous green, quickly sputtering out beneath a douche of sand wet with vinegar, ready for just such an attack. Then, to the surprise of all, a quick shift of wind and a towering sea conspired against the vindictive. It rose, it heeled, it crashed against the rugged side of the Santa Isabel, crushing in the weaker vessel against the overhang. A few of the English found finger and toe holds in the deep scrollwork. They came up the chains, through the gun ports, making their perilous way through rushing water that dragged 3 of them away. 5 reached the Spanish deck. 9 bloody, worn-out men, last of the Santa Isabel's hundreds, battle insanity in their red-dimmed eyes, found strength to meet them as they came. Dagger met dirk, a musket exploded, a Spaniard choked as the teeth of a dying Englishman met his jugular. His heels drummed once or twice on the splintered deck. Then only the slap of the waves was to be heard on the sinking galleon. It was night again when a giant wave broke through a hole in the bulwarks, sloshed in and out of the scuppers, and icily drenched Gunnar's covering. Gasping for breath and stung by salt in his many abrasions, the young man ripped himself free with his dirk. He could see at once that the ship was far gone. It heaved sluggishly, slow in the water. There was a rumbling below as the wash of the deep currents in the hold carried empty barrels and floating cases to and fro against the sides. There was no one at the tiller. It swung idly, and the deck was strewn with bodies. Swiftly he examined all, but found no signs of life and consigned them to the seething waves. Plaything of the elements, the doomed Santa Isabel careened toward the land, a derelict hulk drifting far too close to an inhospitable coast. The gale and rain had stopped. Clouds hid the moon from sight, holding no promise. However, Leon Gunnar had no need of moonlight to trace the outline of the shore. It was well marked. So far as eye could see, beacon fires flamed along the horizon, like a glittering curved necklace of diamonds upon black velvet. There men waited, dark fir bogs, enemies alike of England and of Spain, made savage by long years of oppression and displacement, clothed in hides and starving enough to eat their meat raw when they could get any. This was opportunity not to be missed. Riches were coming in from the Atlantic's bounty. They danced about, armed with spiked poles, to drag in their fellow Christians as the bodies washed in. This was not the first wreck that they had met. The dead had participated in a share-out of the paid chests on the others. They had bags of ducats lashed to their wrists or hung about their necks. The living had the same, and they were in no condition to resist. If they did, they would soon be dead. The kerns waited, keeping the beacons high. They would slay until arms grew weary. It was their day to profit. A light wind rose. It was chill, cutting through Leon's saggy garments. He shivered and looked about for something to throw across his shoulders. Nearby, a black heap appeared to be a cloak, flung haphazard over an upturned keg, but as he touched it, a movement startled him. He drew back. Beneath the cloak crouched a little dark man. Leon noticed that the fellow's eyes sparkled strangely as he grinned. His teeth were long and sharp. His hair was grey and stringy upon his head. His coarse eyebrows joined into a continuous bar, lending him a wild and sinister appearance. "Ah, friend, well met. We are alone at last." Leon harked back into his memory. He found nothing there that recalled the presence of this man aboard the Santa Isabel. "No," said the little creature. It was as though he answered a question. "You have not seen me here before, it is true, but I know you well. I have been close to you all your life. I watched over you when you were born, during your youth, and I knew when you first planned to reach Scotland. Tell me, what do you carry about your neck?" Leon felt a peculiar antipathy to this strange man. He made a surly answer. "If you know so much, you know that too." He loosened his dirk, and his eyes were cold upon him. Aye, that I do," the dwarf cackled. "Is it not part of a certain key to a certain tomb in France? Blois, perhaps? Tell me true. Are you not in search of its mate in Scotland?" In spite of himself, Leon was surprised, but somehow this seemed to be the culmination of his long journeys. He inspected the dark dwarf, but now with recognition and a little fear. "I think I know who you are. You are the persecutor of my people. Archdemon, you are the master. You are here to prevent my success, I know. Have you come to kill me also?" The master nodded. A saturnine smile exposed his white fang-like teeth. "It can be your turn to go, unless you choose to live." Leon laughed. He gestured toward the flaming shore. "By daylight the ship will strike upon those rocks. That will be the end of us both. I do not believe that even you can escape. Listen to the crash of the breakers. You can neither save nor harm me now." The master drew himself up and faced into the wind. It had, once more, increased to a gale while they had been talking. Mumbling to himself, he performed odd gyrations with his arms, ending with palms pressed against the growing tempest in an attitude of command. The wind dropped, became a breeze, and finally lessened to gentle puffs of air. The clouds raced above the sinking galleon, but it floated in an area of utter peace and quiet. As the waves flattened, the wind stopped. "Do you now doubt the master's power?" Leon shook his head. "I brought you here. I aided your progress to Corunna. I implanted in your mind the suggestion that you take ship there for England. I caused the storms to rise, sent the armada to seek shelter in that port so you could board. My will alone has broken the sea power of Spain. Delays, winds, niggardly equipment, I fermented them all. You were the catalyst because you were with the fleet. I had the power to smash the armada. It is ruined forever. Poor timorous Sidonia. If I did not hate men so much, I could almost feel sorry for him. Spain will blame him for the loss of 65 ships and 20,000 men. They will never know that the master met his fleet and fought, this time, on the side of the English." His voice had a sinister ring. His gaze was fixed upon the shore. "They shall have their turn. They also are of the accursed. But mine is the glory today. Sidonia will never meet Parma now. What is it that such a scourge of the world wants with an individual such as me? Your body after death, to use as it suits my pleasure and with your consent." The master's answer came without hesitation. "If you will promise me to be my willing slave, I will save your life now. Further, you shall have until the time of your natural death to live as you ordinarily would. I reserve only this condition. If you call upon my help, if you visit that tomb in Blois, then you forfeit all days of life beyond 30 years from now." Gunnar made a rapid mental calculation. He had but just passed 21. Death seemed certain in a few hours, without some unforeseen aid. A sinking vessel lay beneath his feet, an unknown shore ahead that seemed alive with savages. At the very moment, their eerie, threatening cries came to him like those of lonely devils wandered far from their home in the pits. Across the heaving seas, the sounds came faintly to him in the ominous, unnatural silence around the galleon. The prospect was dismal. He shivered. He might, in the normal course of life, count on another 60 years. He was assured of 30. Even this seemed a long time. Gunnar made, to himself, a solemn vow to keep away from France. He would never call upon the master. God might intervene. He turned to his enemy, who, smiling slyly, appeared to be following his thoughts. "I promise, I will serve you after my death. I acknowledge the conditions of the pact." "So be it," cried the little man, and whistled through his hands. Instantly the gale whooped through the shreds of rigging, and the waves rose high again. Above the shout of the elements, Leon Gunnar heard, as he hurried for shelter, the ululation of the master's leering laugh. He shivered again, with more than cold. Something psychic warned that he had been a fool. It queried with an inward jeering as to the meaning behind the promise he had just made. Half-light preceded morning. Leon came out in it, after a time of terrors in the demolished cabin, issuing forth to see the master shrouded in a long black cloak, leaning on the bulwark. The master smiled and beckoned him to approach. "We are friends now, Gunnar," he said, with an underlying fierce humor. "What do you think of this?" Leon caught his breath at the sight before him. They were very near a sandy beach, where broke a violent sea. 2 galleons had preceded them and were pounding themselves into pieces among bordering rocks. The forecastle of a third, supported only at one end, swung to and fro, held precariously pinned there. Although swept and drenched by high combers, Leon could see men upon the wreckage. They waved piteously at the Santa Isabel as she lurched nearer, as though their frantic warnings could thrust her away. Surf and beach were cluttered with bodies. The dark people were down in hundreds, stripping the dead, knocking some of the living on the head, leaving others naked to perish of the cold. Naked themselves, to more easily rush into the water, for boxes, bales, and a booty too rich to wait for. There was no look of mercy about any of them. With a grinding crash, the Santa Isabel drove into the floating wreckage, and the remaining mast went by the board. At the same time, the forecastle of the other galleon was torn loose, swept from its rocks, and foundered. Leon had no remembrance of swimming, but found himself on the shore among the howling wreckers. He had a tight grasp of the master's hand, and the black cloak was lapped about them both. "Take care," growled the master. "They cannot see you while you are with me. The cloak of invisibility protects us both." Boats, an upturned tender, hatches, spars and cordage mingled with the dead upon the shingle. As they passed among these, following the edge of the water, a man came in upon a drifting scuttleboard, his leg bleeding badly from a blow by a spar in the surf. Leon recognized in him a Don Cuellar, commander of the San Pedro, a man for whose valor the younger man felt a deep admiration. "Let us go along in his company," he said to the master, and they followed. A miserable figure, the looters, who were plundering the well-dressed, took little notice of him. He crawled along until he came to some rushes, where he lay and hid himself. "He is safe there," said the master. "We will see him again." They passed through the sea wrack and to the high heaps of salvage and entered a lane that led up through brush toward the hills. Still held close within the protection of the black cloak, Leon passed unseen within a few feet of the nearest fire and those who pushed at each other, squabbling over some lucky find. The sound of their alien voices came faint to his ear as though they were far away. A man who had stripped himself for the beach ran toward him, wild-faced and hairy. The youth caught his breath, sure that he was seen, but the man veered as he came near and rushed by, waving a bit of pointed stick, red and dripping, his hand bloody to the elbow, and in it a severed finger, still bearing a massy golden ring, heavy with jewels. They threaded their way through the cordon of hill beacons. Near one, where he had been dragged, lay a naked greybeard. Leon recognized the chief gunner of the Rata Coronada. As they approached, his dying eyes seemed to pierce their protection with an enhanced perception, sensing a compatriot. He feebly raised himself on one elbow. "Agua! Agua!" The plea came from salt-cracked lips. A virago, tending a pot, struck him down with a heavy iron ladle, so that he rolled against the feet of one who appeared to be in some sort of control, as he wore a pair of tight-fitting knee breeches and a goatskin jacket open in the front. This man snarled and kicked the gunner's body away. The Spaniard cried out as his hair began to burn, for he now lay upon glowing embers. The cruel one seized a large rock, coolly, as though it was a matter of familiar practice. With a single blow, he beat out the brains of the hapless gunner. Leon's soul seemed to turn steel within him at the horrible sight. Freeing his dirk with his right hand, clutching the master's scraggy wrist with his left, they leapt toward the fire. As they neared the light of the flames, the master stopped, seemingly in pain. Leon stared in wonder. Did the fear of fire hold him back? Leon had no time to consider. He threw off the cloak fold, raced to the fire, and sprang cat-like upon the back of the murderer. It was a second's work to yank the shaggy head back, another to draw his keen blade across that bronzed bull throat. The throng shouted at this tattered, sea-soaked apparition that had materialized before them out of nothing. Blood spurted hissing on the flames, and the furbolg fell, without a cry, into the fire across the body of his victim. The pot overturned and sent a flood of scalding broth over the old hag. In the excitement and confusion, Leon ran back several steps into the brush heaps and by the master's side. Invisible to all but him, they were both again unseen. The master laughed for a third time. This was a protégé much to his liking. Hand in hand, master and pupil marched inland from the coast. Because of the Gunnars, the master had crossed the channel. Europe lay behind. Here was a new hunting ground, and the first kill was satisfying to this enemy of all things human. He was still chuckling to himself as the sun rose beyond the hills. Leon was suddenly aware that he held nothing. He was alone. With the first ray of sunlight, the master had vanished as mysteriously as he had appeared aboard the wrecked galleon. The Bug Wolves of Castle Manglana by H. Warner Munn. It was late in October, In the year of our Lord, 1588, Manglana stood on a promontory projecting far out into the broad lake, whose ripples lapped against the base of the castle wall. No boats plied Loch Anne. All these had been deliberately axed and sunk a week before. It was then that the O'Neill, owner of the castle, had retreated with his family and retainers into the mountains, leaving Gunnar and 8 other rescued and befriended Spaniards to defend themselves, as they had refused to flee. 1,800 English soldiers, collected in Dublin and led by Ireland's Lord Deputy, lay encamped now between the castle and safety. Their orders were to scour the west country and take no prisoners from the 13 galleons known to be wrecked upon that part of the coast. They had no intention of deviating from those pleasurable commands. A swallow skimmed by, leaving a trail of widening circles on the still water. Leon sighed and followed it with his eyes, wishing that he too had wings with which to leave this wild land far behind. How soon would he flee to Scotland and find his kindred? A crack of musket and a jubilant yell broke into his reverie. He turned to see a bearded man, dressed in the saffron mantle of an Irish gallows-glass, dancing about the battlement. "By a lady!" he shouted. "I got the dirty spy that time. See him kicking in the marsh." "Well done, Cuella," Leon applauded. "We can't waste ammunition. Every shot must find an English heart." Cuella became serious. He looked around to see if anyone was listening. "Boy," he whispered, "you don't know how true that is. I was prowling about in the powder room today. I found that 3 of those powder kegs O'Neill left us were some of those picked up on the beaches after the wrecks." "Well?" "No, ill. Water soaked in somehow. We've got a half keg left and a dozen muskets to fight an army with. Maybe we can roll it and crumble it, but I'm afraid Senora Cuella had best look for another man. Nil desperatum, sir. Never despair. Time is fighting for us too, you know. The English don't know our strength, and a couple of heavy rains will drown them out, so keep up your spirits, and you will kiss your good lady." Leon pointed toward the landward side of the promontory, far enough from the castle so that musket fire could not reach the defenders, lay the camp of the English, spread along such high ground as existed in the low swampland. Now and then some foolhardy soldier would leave the camp to try and find a way through quags and moss hags and effect an entrance into the castle by plotting a way for his fellows. There had been an offer of 10 gold nobles for such a way. None had yet been found, but many seekers had been drowned in the mud. The causeway was the only road, and that lay under fire. After the first few frontal dashes had ended in slaughter and a disorderly retreat, the English wisely sat down in their camps and commenced a policy of waiting for starvation to drive the Spaniards into their hands. They could not know that the defenders were so few that food was ample within the walls for at least 2 months more. This did not greatly disturb the besieged, but the failing supply of powder was an event of startling importance. When the first Englishmen reached the castle wall without being fired upon, an overwhelming wave of attackers would follow. The end was inevitable. "Ah, Gunnar," answered Cuella, ruefully. "You don't understand the feelings of a father. All of us here have families waiting for us except you. When you watch your own children growing taller and see the fondness in their mother's eyes as she looks at them and smiles at you, you won't feel like waiting for some other man to step into your slippers. Almost a year we've been away, and no one back home knows if we still live or where. You came ashore on that galleon that smashed into mine on the rocks of Sligo Bay, you said. Do you remember the burned monastery? The 12 valiant soldiers of Spain hanging dead from the rafters in the nave. But for God, His grace, we might have dangled beside them. Leon nodded vigorously. And the blessed saints all tumbled on the ground beneath their feet. Almighty, I can see them yet. It was horrible, agreed Quella. Only a miracle could have saved us from those hungry madmen that plundered the wrecks. I say now, I shall forever remember that kilted noble who saved my life. I wish I knew his name. Leon spoke up bitterly. You don't think he did it because he loves Spaniards, do you? I think he had 2 reasons. He had to maintain authority, so he could demand a share of the ships wrecked in his territory, and he hates England as he does hellfire. He gave us shelter and sent us on here to his friend, the O'Neill, because he wanted to get rid of us. If he had cared anything about us, he would have helped us get back home. We are enemies of the English, not friends of his. True, Quella assented, but I could be most friendly with his pretty dark-haired daughter. Santa Maria, those eyes, that smile. We are alive because of him, and a blessed miracle. If I get out of here, I swear by Saint Joseph of Compostela, I will go back and thank her personally. And if she tells her father what other things I say, that will be up to her, for I have some interesting things in mind. He crossed himself fervently. Gunnar, in disgust, turned to his post of duty on the eastern wall. Only too well the young man knew that the saints had nothing whatever to do with the bringing of himself, Quella, and the young naval officer to the dubious protection of Castle Manglana. An unseen companion to the other 2 had journeyed with them. He was powerful enough to protect those whom he wished against any foe, and he, a dread enemy of mankind, was self-called the Master. It remained to be seen. Leon buried the thought deep, lest it be somehow read, whether or not that arrogant assumption could be rendered void. Quella shouted down the stairway, Gomez, tell Ramon to bring up another flask of powder. 3 more muskets too, and what grenades we still have. No, better we try a keg of that bad powder with a fuse. Save the grenades for close quarters. Tell Diego, Enrique, and Rodriguez to come. I think those English frogs are going to puddle jump again. Gunnar ran back across the flat roof. It was true that an odd commotion was taking place in the camp, indistinctly perceptible in the dusk. Then, far across the fog-shrouded marshes, arose a puff of white smoke, visible as a rapidly expanding ring. An eerie whistle rose to a scream, which steadily mounted, passed overhead, and a heavy missile plunged sullenly into the lake. Echoes were still in flight between the cliff of Loch Erne when a thud shook the castle. Both Gunnar and Quella felt a slight sensation of giddiness as though the firm structure rocked beneath them. A dismal wail came from below, and the 2 watchers gazed into each other's eyes with dawning comprehension and fear. A man staggered up the stairs and came out on the roof. His hair was crisped and smoking, the beard gone from one side of his face, and sparks ran to and fro on his charred clothing. He blinked, bleary-eyed, and stumbled straight toward Quella, saluting with a blistered hand the tacitly recognized leader of the garrison. Madre de Dios, Gomez! Speak! What has happened? Kuela reached to steady him. "Ramon," said the man with difficulty, his eyes rolling upward as he choked, "went into the magazine with a lighted torch." He collapsed, still at the position of salute, across Kuela's feet. "That finishes us." Kuela's face drained of color as he looked at Leon. "The English have got a cannon up to our range at last, and now our powder is gone." "Sir, Gomez is dead." Leon had thrust a hand inside the fallen man's goatskin jacket. "So are we all," came the hopeless answer. "Come, let us see how many are left." As the two started for the stairs, another distant report sounded. Gunnar turned back. "Go. I will watch here and call if there is an attack." "Very well," replied Kuela. "Adios, amigo. Make your peace. This is the end." He disappeared in the billows of smoke pouring up the stairway. "It is not the end," murmured an unctuous voice in Gunnar's ear. He recognized the voice at once. The master was making his usual nightly visit, as he had whenever Gunnar was alone. "Are you utterly merciless?" Gunnar whirled upon him, passionately. "Is there no pity, no trace of humanity left in you? Beast, fiend, devil, you disgrace the name of man. You are a monster. In the name of every holy saint, I command you, by your fear of God, I plead with you, leave me and let me die in peace." A cold ferocity narrowed the master's eyes. Even in the dusk, they gleamed. "Do not be misled by the body I happen to be wearing just now. I have other semblances to surprise you. I am not a man, and neither am I your idea of a beast. Your gods are not mine. You will soon learn that I am not human. As for mercy and pity, I had them long ago, until they were stolen from me. However, I did not come to tell you this, but to show you a way out, and perhaps to help those who are with you." Gunnar's face lighted. He took a step closer to the odd creature who held him so close in that pact of servitude. Bitterly, many times he had regretted the pledge he had given aboard the sinking galleon. Perhaps for once it might be of some small benefit to himself. "What do you have in mind? Tell me quickly." "Do you know that tonight is Halloween, the one night in all the year, except for Walpurgis, when it is easiest for a man to become a wolf from sunset to sunrise?" Gunnar chuckled. "You may have wonderful powers. I admit you can make yourself invisible. I know you can lull storms, but be reasonable. No man can become a wolf. That is only a French and German superstition. I have heard there are no wolves in Ireland." "There shall be 2 tonight." The master's tone was sardonically grim. "As I have already told you, I am not a man. You are too ignorant to understand what I am. If you had traveled more, you would know what you call a superstition is fact, known and believed in all countries and all ages. I, the master, created that knowledge, first of all upon this planet. Strip off your clothes. We will see what shall befall the English upon this hallowed evening of blood and glory." Gunnar hesitated. The master's eyes flared vividly red. He moved closer, fixing the young man like stone. "Strip." The command was stern. "I am giving you another choice. I promised you, upon the Santa Isabel, your full term of life, if you bound yourself to me after death. I offered you 30 years if you found it necessary to call upon my help. This is the moment. You need me. Choose now if you are willing to become a thing that will scatter the English out of that camp like leaves before the blast. If you will it, and you are the only one who can save the lives of your friends, I shall cause such storms to arise tomorrow that the marshes will be flooded. If not, why, then you can watch them die tomorrow when the castle is taken. Of course, you will be saved by me, according to our contract, but you will remember all your life that you could have rescued your friends and would not. Leon Gunnar considered. He was alone in the world. He had no one to care for, no one to weep for him if he died, or welcome him if he lived. 30 years. It seemed a long time. Something might happen to defeat the master's plans. He believed the promise would be kept. Cruella and the rest would be spared. Senora Cruella, the children, Spain and love, and sunshine in weary hearts. I will abide with you. Without moving his eyes from that twisted face, he began to remove his clothes. I wish to fight, and I beseech your help. 30 years then, my lad, clucked the black dwarf. He stooped his head over Gunnar's bare arm. The young man felt a sharp pain in the hollow of his elbow. The master backed away and threw an evil-smelling liquid upon him. Too rapidly for any distinguishing of separate words, a low incantation followed. Then, agony unspeakable. It was as though every bone in the Spaniard's body had been violently wrenched from its position and as violently reset. He fell to the roof, groaning. Was it fancy that he could not speak? Was it true that his cries sounded like yelps and howls instead of words? His nose seemed strangely long. In fact, it was no longer a nose, but a muzzle. A surge of strange odors became apparent. He rolled in pain, reaching out with his hands. They came within his vision, and he howled again. They had claws. They had toes. They were not hands. They were, could it be possible, the hairy paws of a wolf. He felt a sharp kick in the ribs. The dwarf seemed wroth. Be quiet, you fool. You will have the others here. Watch now and see what you are. The master fell forward, his scrawny limbs shrinking, his face melted, features formless, then remolding frightfully. Gunnar meant to gasp. The sound came out as a whine. The black cloak hung to the new, still changing body. It was no longer cloth. It was long, grizzled, shaggy hair. 2 tailless wolves crouched side by side upon the roof of Castle Manglana as the full moon rose above the flat marsh. Gunnar felt a strange wild thrill in his veins. He seemed to have imbibed something of the master's proud, alien spirit. He was no longer human, but a beast. He felt as a wild, predatory animal should. Man was his enemy. Below, in the castle, were men. They would kill him, should he not kill. He stalked, stiff-legged, over to the open entrance. His hackles lifted, and foam drooled from his avid jaws. How strong that hated man smell! He took another step forward, sniffing at the stairwell, and howled long and dismally. He would have hurled himself down at his former friends had not a chill command halted him. He stood still, trembling violently. He had heard no words, and there was still man enough in his cosmos for this to bring fear. He knew himself to be a machine for one purpose only. His former life was smoke lost in the mist. The purpose was to kill as long as he could fight. In his mind surged up the red tide of murder. He whirled, snarling. The black wolf was regarding him with grim humor. White fangs flashed, red tongue, slavering, lolled out in a savage grin. "You will do." The words made themselves felt without sound in the grey wolf's brain. "More men are across the still water. Follow me." The loathsome black beast loped across the roof and sprang through one of the embrasures. That, which had so lately been a man, instantly followed. It plunged after the leader and struck out for shore. By the time they had crossed the lake, the sky had become obscured with clouds. 10 minutes earlier, not one had been in sight. The shore was an indeterminate region, neither true land or clear water. They sank belly deep in the ooze and struggled to a firmer footing. There was a musty smell from green-scummed pools filled with rotting leaves and small, dead things. A drizzle of rain now spat and hissed in the slime. "This will keep our prey under shelter," thought the grey wolf, and the black swung his grin toward him as though words had been uttered. They loped into the shallows, swam a bit, and waded through the last of the sucking mud. Beyond lay the camp. Cautiously they skirted the edges. A sentry approached, and leaving the grey behind, the black wolf sneaked forward, gathering his legs beneath him and his wiry muscles tensed. His whole body quivered with anticipation. A leap, a stifled sob, a splash in the puddles, and the man was down, with his throat opened wide and bubbling. Another sentry approached, peering out for the source of the faint noises. Now it was the grey wolf's turn. Both, with muzzles dabbled red, slunk into the sleeping and defenseless camp. As the grey had supposed, no one else was visible. In their quarters, some of the English slept, others were dozing, but over all lay quiet peace, disturbed only by the patter of rain that hushed any possible sound of velvet footfalls. Locating the cannon, the black wolf stopped, sent out a silent command, and the grey prowled, watchful, alert to protect, while the master assumed the human form once more. Only an instant he was busy there. Then the misshapen, tailless wolf things trotted on to the camp, lurching a little, for their hindquarters were higher than those of an ordinary wolf. A brush and canvas shelter lay a little apart from the others, and from it came stertorous snoring. An instant of hesitation. Both wolves bellied through the doorway. Then they slunk out. The snores had stopped. The eyes of the two met, gleaming with strange exhilaration. They separated, the black coursing along one line of shelters, hunting for quarry, while the grey commenced dipping in and out of another line. A doubled trail of red drops on the wet ground marked where they had passed. No alarm ahead as yet, and behind, a quiet that would never again be broken by the occupants of those visited shelters. The dreadful business went on for a long time without interruption. The black wolf had finished 2 lines of shelters and was halfway along with a third, while the grey, joyously drunk with killing, was slaughtering along the end of his second when a man awoke from frightful dreams to look into the jaws that slavered and find a more horrid reality there. He had just time to scream, "Werewolves!" before his spine cracked in those iron jaws. The other occupant of the shelter roused. His yell was incoherent as he also died. At once there was a commotion, men running about without aim or purpose, looking for an enemy band of raiders, not realizing what they were to fight until they saw the two unreal beasts, so ungainly and so quick to leap in and out of the lines of shelters. An Irish renegade, remembering Dadgar of the Boar's Head, regretted that he had taken English gold to become a guide. He fell on his knees at the sight. "Demons!" he howled. "The bogs! The bogs! The bog wolves are after us!" and went crawling away toward the cannon on hands and knees, squattering through the mud. The word meant nothing to the English, but it went on racing through the camp, adding to the general terror of the troops, well familiar, in their country, of tales of men beasts. Fantasy was coming true. It was at their very throats. And all the while, the two untouchable creatures, making the most of the confusion, were sweeping swiftly about, pulling down one here and another there, combining their weights upon those who ran before them, bearing them to the earth, and snarling like mad things as they worried the center of the camp and headed back toward the castle. On a little rise of the ground they stopped, plain against the lighter sky and directly in line of fire of the cannon. The guide, breathing a hurried prayer that the cannon was loaded, depressed the piece and, surrounded by a frantic crowd of soldiers, ignited the charge. The mighty concussion that followed shook the camp. A lurid flash of light lit up the billowing clouds. Fragments of iron and mangled bodies flew everywhere, and in Castle Manglana, 6 men looked at each other with surprise. Could they dare believe their missing comrade had found a way to help them? They were not to know. Flimsy shelters in the English camp were down in many places. When the deafened survivors of the explosion thought of the two invulnerable Harriers again, the rise of ground was bare. An increase of rain became a steady downpour, driven by a gusty wind through the wreckage, chilling the wounded, extinguishing fires, bringing the surface of Loch Earn up to lap over the marshlands. Little waves became low surf and crashed against the base of the promontory, higher through the remainder of the night, long into the next day, as the storm continued without a break. Castle Manglana became an island, the lake its protecting moat. Towards evening there was a lull. Some of the English deserted then, and as though the skies had waited for this, the rain began to come down, once more to continue for days. The position of the camp became completely untenable before another cannon could be secured. Realizing this, the flag was struck, gear packed, and the men moved out, to the derisive cheers of the men on the island castle walls. Cuella and the 5 Spaniards gave thanks. Soon they would be going home. But on that first night, miles away, the master stood somberly regarding a grey wolf crouching at his feet. His black cloak was drawn high about his head, peeking as though through pointed ears, still pricked upward against the cloth. He pointed. "That way lies Antrim. From there you can easily take a boat to Scotland. I have told you where to find your surviving relative, and I am sure you will like her. Run now. Get as fast as you can before morning. Take the clothes of the first man you meet. You must kill him an hour before dawn. What caused the cannon to blow up? Simple. I put in an extra charge of powder and filled the muzzle with mud. Goodbye, Leon Gunnar. You have been a joy to me. What a worthy slave. Enjoy your 30 years until we meet again. A second later, the grey was alone. What of man there was in his being was buried deep. An animal raced across the bogs and moss hags toward Antrim, in the direction the master had indicated. As he ran, he snarled, looking avidly from side to side for something human to attack. Senora Cuella would someday see her man again. She would never know that an unknown, friendless, and lonely wanderer had given years of his life so that the 6 men with families might be together again. Nor, had she known, would she have believed. But he, who had sacrificed to save others, did not, at this moment, have such a thought to console him. That would come later. Now, he had only the terrible urge to run, to lope on through the night, toward the release of dawn, toward Antrim, toward Scotland. All this in the most desperate haste and urgency. In the morning, grief, repentance, and rage. He would be a naked man, never to know again the unholy power and desires of this one scarlet night. In the Tomb of the Bishop by H. Warner Munn. When the tomb was new, and the smell of freshly cut stone still hung about the rock that formed it, men came with sad faces, bearing a burden. They walked slowly, and with reverence they placed therein a man, whom they supposed was finished forever with walking and all other such trivial matters that interest the living. After the proper ceremonies had been observed, they shut and locked the massive iron door. Leaving the poor dead thing there, they parted and went their several ways, to think little more of the remains of one who had so lately been held in such high respect. For some while, on anniversaries, a few who had loved the bishop for himself more than his office came and placed flowers there, and wept a little for all the hopes and fears that they were burdened with, and when their hearts were comforted, they went away. As the years passed, there were not so many visitors, and they came less often. All the while the great iron key hung in a secret place in the ancestral castle of the Gunnars, and it was never used, and it was the only one that would fit the intricate lock that fastened close the tomb of the bishop. And all the while the worm, who is lord of us all, went to and fro within the tomb, and revelled in his own manner, and was filled and well content. And all the while the soul of the bishop basked in the mellow light of paradise, caring no more for his body or its future than we, here on earth, care for a shoe that has been outworn and cast aside. One by one, those that had known the bishop ceased to visit the tomb, and passing from the places that had known them well, also went their ways to join him and become content. And the worm, who is lord of us all, finding nothing there to keep him longer, left the bones of the bishop in silence and darkness and peace. Lichens and mosses and vines climbed over the grey stones. Rust flaked thickly red in the hinges of the heavy iron door, and in the secret place where hung the key, a great fat spider lived out her life in meditation which was not disturbed. In the tomb of the bishop, time was of little account, but outside 100 withering years brought changes that were inevitable, however little they could be expected. One night, men came to the tomb in desperate haste, casting glances behind them. They were sorely afraid, and when they placed a key in the lock and it would not turn, they panted as though they had been running far and yet had farther to go by morning. They tried another key, and still another, and the lock would not turn, and despair came upon them, for it was most important that the tomb should be opened. At last, the youngest of the men came across the garden, and in his hand was the ancient key, and behind him, in the castle of the Gunnars, which was burning with a great crackling and a vast amount of light, an old fat she-spider cursed the man with all the power of a spider's curse, for he had taken away a home that, to her line, had been far more ancient and hallowed than any place can be to men. It took 4 men to push open that rusty door. They did not remain long inside, but placed a parcel well wrapped and protected against the damp upon the casket where lay the bishop's dry and aged bones. In the parcel was a book whose pages were made of human skin, and which was a story which was grim and horrible and a little sad. So they left it there, where they thought themselves to be safe, seeing each other no more till the day after their deaths, when some of them were reunited. And behind them, rust filled again the hinges and gathered in the cracks around the door, and the lichens and mosses and all the green vines which had been torn away conspired once more to hide the signs of that entrance. But the key had split neatly in 2 halves, and one of the men had taken one half, and his elder brother had taken the other, and the movements of that last half had been chronicled already. Over the tomb of the bishop crawled another half a century, but if you had chanced to enter, you would have noticed that there was now a feeling within that someone else was present. Perhaps, if you had laid your ear very close to the casket where the book lay, you would have heard a faint rustling inside that sounded like a very small mouse that could not or would not be quiet, and then you would have left, I am sure. 2 men walked in the old Gunnar Park and came to the garden, a long wilderness of weeds. One appeared to be an extremely old man, but his wrinkles and his white hair came from an inward trouble, not from the pitiless claws of time. The other was but just come to his maturity, but there was a look of knowledge in his youthful eyes that spoke of evil things that no man should know and live, lest the rest of the world should find cause to regret. After it was too late to prevent such knowledge to be used in unspeakable action. Leon Gunnar had married in Scotland, not for beauty or wealth, but for dark wisdom known only to the followers of the old religion of the mother. It was not a happy marriage, but he bore it for the promise of a son who would be strong in body and wise and wily of mind. When that son was born, His mother wept, for in that moment there came upon her the gift of seeing, and she had no wish for further life or any other child. So Leon was left alone with the boy. His aunt, who was also a witch, took over his care until he was old enough to be apprenticed to a warlock sorcerer. It was Leon Gunnar's hope that this ancestry, long trained and arcane lore, would provide a way to fight the Black Master to whom he had bound himself. Now, with but a day remaining of the 30 years that the pact had allowed him, he was come with his son, after the book which had something in it that the younger man must know. In a thicket, where leaves were wilting as though blight had suddenly come upon them and were falling to earth, though it was summer, a monstrosity gloated and hugged itself and chattered in a voice more shrill than any bat, as it watched the culmination of a long-planned part of its revenge. It was close when they unlocked the door with a shiny new key made from the pattern of the split and rusty one, but they did not see it. Its voice was so high that the older man could not hear it at all as they pried back the crumbling door with all their strength and short iron bars. The senses of the younger warlock were keener, made so by his training. He stopped his work to listen, but the master was more cunning than he and made no more noises. After a little, Leon's son shook his head and continued the work. It was alert and waiting for its chance when they entered the tomb and saw there the rotten old casket and upon it what they had long desired. It was watching when the younger came out of the tomb with the precious volume in his arms. It was tittering nervously when Leon Gunnar thought he heard a crepitant rustling inside the old casket and turned back to listen. The young Scottish warlock was on his knees in the weeds, tearing off the protective coverings of the book, when he heard a quiet sound behind him. He looked back. The door that had almost defied the combined strength of 2 men was closing itself without a creak or rasp from the corroded hinges. From inside the tomb came a scream that held all the terror imaginable to the mind of man. The young man cried out, "Father!" In agony of spirit, he reached for the door's edge. A mist swirled before him, out of which stared 2 red, burning eyes. Without a sound, he dropped in his tracks. The door closed. Inside, Leon Gunnar had seen, before the tomb went completely dark, the old wooden casket fall to dust. It was the sight of the horror that sat upright in that heap of dry rot and punk, its jaws clicking and its bony arms reaching out for him, that he had screamed. It was then he knew that his 30 years of life had come to an end. After a long while, the door opened. A third individual appeared in the opening. About 4 feet in height, the master was wrapped in his cloak of black. Only his glittering eyes were uncovered beneath his deep hood. In them lurked a suspicion of moisture as he looked upon the interior of the tomb, where bits of dry, hard bones mingled with scraps of tattered flesh. Had the young warlock not been unconscious outside that place of sudden and frightful death, and had he heard the master soliloquize, he would have been amazed in his disbelief. Tears? Incredible. "I have been a fool," the master mused, "and I have made one of my few mistakes. I gave only a will to tear and mangle to that heap of dry bones. I should have instructed it to save enough of the body intact so that I could use it. Now the essence is lost. There is nothing of value for me to take." He directed his piercing gaze into a corner of the dark chamber. "You have won, Gunnar, through no wisdom or planning of your own. Our pact is ended, and you are free. I shall not hinder the return of your boy to Scotland. It will be amusing to allow him to play with his studies for a while. Let him learn what magic he can. I will meet him again when he is worth fighting. Leon Gunnar, take your freedom." Something shot by the master and out the door, with the zip of an invisible arrow, audible to no senses but those of the black dwarf. Slowly he closed the iron door and turned the key. The ripped vines fell back into place. There was silence and darkness and peace in the hidden tomb of the former bishop. And the worm, who is lord of us all, came in the night and found therein that which made him merry. But a tortured soul had found its way to paradise. The young warlock was on the road home, carrying the book of ill omen, and where the master went in deep regret is yet to be told. If you've enjoyed this content, consider supporting the Eldritch Archives to grow and make more content. Become a supporter on Patreon, buy an audiobook on Bandcamp, or like, comment on, or share one of the videos on YouTube. And as always, thank you for listening.